I'm Myohye, and I'm the guiding teacher for Lotus Heart Zen in Oneida, New York. And I suppose the reason why Douglas asked me to talk to you all today is that my beginning training in Buddhism was in a temple. And from a very wonderful but very tough Korean Buddhist nun. And there's a lot in there that has been so well pounded that even if I wanted to, I couldn't get rid of it. That's the result of training in a temple. And so I have a bit of a unique experience in comparison to a lot of other people who come to Buddhism here in the West and may not have any experience in a traditionally run temple. And so talking about practice form, I think in the West, oftentimes isn't fully appreciated. So hopefully, after I talk a little bit about this and answer any of your questions, you'll have a better appreciation for why we have practice forms and what they are really about, because they're not really about controlling people and making everything boring and stiff, even though that's usually what most of us think it is, because we're rugged individualist Americans and we like everything to be special and only for us. So I'm going to start by just talking just briefly about why we have form and the correct way of pronouncing it, even if you have 1 or 100, it's always just form, even though once in a while we'll say forms, but really the appropriate term is just form. It's like singular and plural. So the form in any kind of spiritual practice, as Barbie mentioned, Catholicism has lots of form. And every church or synagogue or temple, they're all going to have their own form. And so even if you go from one church to another church, same denomination, their forms could be somewhat different between them, because there are traditional forms, and then there are forms that establish themselves because of the community that's practicing. And so a lot of what we practice in Lotus Heart Zen, and what we had kind of established when we would have retreats at for Five Mountain Zen Order, would be modified form. Some of it has roots in the traditional practice, but a lot of it was adapted because we're not, when we, with the exception of when we had it in Kansas City, that was the only time we had it in an actual temple. And in that case, we followed the temple form that she, the nun or the abbot who ran that Vietnamese temple, we defer to the form that is practiced there. So it's always important to remember that even if you have a form that you've been practiced in, if you go to another place, you never assert your form in their practice space. You always defer to whatever their form is. And that means that you're going to screw up all the time because you're not going to know a lot of the forms. So the best approach is always try to go towards the last and watch everybody. And even with that, be prepared that you're going to mess up, and you'll, depending on how traditional it was, when I would mess up at another temple that would be a Korean temple, like when I was in Korea, I usually got smacked. But fortunately, Douglas and I were trained by a teacher who said, we don't do smacking anymore. So the Asians, they love to smack their students. So you get pretty thick-skinned after a while when you think you've figured it out and you do it, and then bang, there you are, smacked. Nope, that was wrong. So your particular group may develop or adapt some practice forms that we at Lotus Heart Zen won't have, and that will be based on the space you're in, the people that practice there, and what you practice. Some places don't chant, so chanting form isn't going to be necessary. Some places don't do sitting meditation, and so sitting form is not going to be part of that. So there's always going to be some variation within even the same tradition, depending on the particular place. And that was the thing that was so hard for me, because we would travel from temple to temple all over Korea, and while there was a lot that was the same, there were always these few things that were different. And for some reason, and I don't know if it's because my teacher memorized everything, but she never screwed up. I was always screwing up. So I just learned after a while, it's like, I will just do everything last and really watch what everybody's doing, and just try to copy as best I could, so that, I didn't get smacked. So when we practice form, what we're actually doing is we're encouraging ourselves, other practitioners, to pay attention and to practice with dignity. And that allows us to bring respect to the practice that we are engaging in. And one of the reasons why that's so important is, I went to a temple in Korea that was up on the mountain. It was the oldest temple in Korea. It was, I think, built in 1000 AD. And everything in there was essentially a relic. I mean, it was like a living museum. And so part of the reason we have practice form, even to the point of how we handle tools in the temple, is because some of those things could be really expensive, really old, or one of a kind. And so we treat and hold all of those things as though they are precious and worthy, or sacred is probably a better way to say it. And if we approach it in that way, then we'll never make the mistake of being careless with something and, break a 1,000-year-old moktak or something. And so there's that aspect of why we have form. It also, paying attention and following through form is also a way of us offering respect to those who are practicing with us. So we raise our Sangha members up in sacredness as well by following a form, because we're essentially shrugging off our separateness and our ego, and we're becoming one cohesive unit that is practicing together. We're plugging ourselves into that form. So we shed our individuality, we shed, our our ego in the sense of like, I'm doing this because I'm important, or I'm doing this because, this is special. We don't move into form for those reasons. We move into form for the opposite reasons, that we are the same, that we are all sacred. And so my performing these rituals is raising us all up. I think the last part about form that I think, well, there's always a practical aspect for a lot of forms. And so I'll talk about some of those when I go into each one. But one of the things that form does that kind of surprised me when I, after practicing it for a long time, after really recognizing that it promotes and encourages harmony within the Sangha, it also is a way for us to break our need for novelty, because when you would, I trained with my teacher for 2.5 years in the temple, and for 2.5 years, 3 days a week, I did the same exact thing in the morning, in the evening, and then on Sundays. And after a while, that, American part of me is like, can we like change this up? Can we like make something more interesting in this, because this is getting boring. It's just the same thing. And of course, I knew better than to say that to my teacher. So I just, kept going through that. And what I came through as a result is, after probably a few months of kind of struggling with, this is, just this so boring. That need for the novelty fell away. And then suddenly there was this whole different engagement with the forms that I had been practicing for months that I previously was bored with. It was like passing through a threshold. And some of you may have experienced something similar if you do a long retreat. And, after a while, in the beginning, it's sort of like, once you get past getting sort of settled into, then suddenly it's like, oh my God, how am I going to survive, any more days of this? It's just so monotonous. And you think, might even go crazy. And then suddenly that all just falls away. And then the whole retreat just kind of melds into one experience. It's the same kind of function that forms perform for us, because as biological beings, we tend to get attached to wanting novelty and wanting new things or more things. And practice forms challenge that, because we stay within the boundaries. And in the beginning, it feels stifling. It feels like anything but free. And yet, once you get past a certain threshold, you find that those structures become entries into total freedom. It may not make sense until you actually experience it. But even freedom in the most basic sense can only exist because of structure. Without structure, freedom is chaos. And so we certainly don't want chaos in our practice space, but we want to feel liberation. And so practice forms, believe it or not, are one of those doorways into that. So whenever you struggle and feel like, maybe we should change things up, that's usually a sign that you're just about to go through that threshold. So persevere a little longer, and you'll find something really wonderful. Not too long, further. So, and then the last thing about form itself is that practicing form is a way for us to get completely in touch with our imperfections while also embodying Buddha's work. So, some of you, I'm sure, have been told that, when we bow to the Buddha, we're not bowing to a god, we're bowing to the Buddha that we all are guaranteed to become because it is in our innate nature. So we're bowing to that we are carrying within ourselves. But we practice because we haven't fully realized that, because we're holding on to these ideas that we're flawed or that we need fixing or that we're not quite there yet. And so our practice and the form reminds us that, we are operating from that point of view while also embodying that we are the perfection that Buddha offers, being a Buddha offers. So we hold those two things simultaneously when we practice form. Because as some of my people will attest, that when we first start learning form in the Dharma room, you feel 100,000 miles away from being a Buddha, right? It's like suddenly like, what's my left and what's my right? And, I bow first or I bow after, suddenly we don't even know how to walk, right? So there's that aspect that the forms show us the way that we hold ourselves. And then we eventually let go, and then the form kind of just guides us. And a lot of times we don't even think about it. We're plugged in. So before I talk about specific forms, are there any questions so far? And if at any time you have a question, just raise a little hand or interrupt me.
I just want to say that none of us have lit ourselves on fire, so we're all doing good about pulling our sleeves up.
That's one of the first ones you have to learn. So I'm just going to walk us through kind of a typical routine, and then we can kind of break it down a little from there. So if we were to have like morning practice in your Dharma space, the first thing, and there's a whole routine that goes into how you wake everybody up, but I'm going to skip over that because I don't think any of you are ever going to plan to have a residential temple space. Oh, by the way, all of what I'm sharing is in our Lotus Heart Zen liturgy book, which if you go to lotusheartzen.org on the homepage, you can download it. And all of what I'm going to share is all in there as well, so you can always refer to it. And there's also chanting form and even a little bit of office structure, like, different positions that people might hold within a temple structure. So once we get everybody ready to practice, most places are going to require you remove shoes, and pay attention, because every temple has a different way of how you place your shoes. It drove me nuts because it was like sometimes the toes faced out, sometimes the toes faced in, and this is before you stepped in. Sometimes they went on a shelf, sometimes they went along the wall. It was always different. So you always have to pay attention to what everybody's doing. I think the variation has more to do with how they can accommodate the shoes. Some places have racks, but other places don't have room for racks. Some places, a lot of the ones in Korea, your shoes stay outside. They don't even go into the building. So you turn them so the toes are out, so that when you leave, you step right into your shoes and go. You don't have to get down and turn them all around. And, and of course, everybody in Korea wears slip-ons, which also is something I learned. It's like pretty quickly after I got there, I went and bought slip-on shoes, because there's nothing more annoying than constantly having to untie and tie shoes over and over and over. So you remove your shoes, and before you enter the Dharma, the practice space, you bow to the altar. Usually the altar will be facing the entry, but not always. Traditionally, the altar should be facing east. So that means the Buddha is looking in the east. But again, sometimes the way a room is set up, you can't do that. But that's the ideal, is, you have the altar is facing east. If you have a donation box, that should always go near the door. And once you bow, you will move to where you're going to sit, whether that's a cushion or a chair. And before you sit, you do a standing bow in front of the cushion or the chair. Some places, I never did this, but some places would have you after you do your standing bow and before you sit, you turn and face the Sangha and you do another standing bow to the Sangha, and then you sit. At any point during practice, you need to get up. You do a sitting bow before you get up. And that would even include if you were doing meditation and you needed to get up to use the bathroom, or you are getting up to go interview with the teacher. You bow before you get up. Then a couple of other important things that if you ever go and practice at a traditional Eastern temple, never face the soles of your feet to the temple or to the altar. Always have the feet facing away. So if you're like sitting and you put your legs out, you don't want your feet facing. So that's why, usually we're seated cross-legged or kneeling, because we're going to keep our feet facing away. We don't really worry too much about that in our Sangha. I don't think many of us could even sit that way, actually. We're not so flexible anymore. So then once you're sat, any the officiant would bow before they go in. Before they sit, they're going to put their robes on, and then do their bows before they sit. A little nitpicky thing that I discovered: when you have your robes, and if you're sitting on a cushion, do not let your robes touch the floor. You tuck them up so they sit onto your cushion. That was one I got smacked for a lot, because you'd move around and then they'd fall, and then because there's always like one person who's eagle-eyed looking for every screw up you make, so that they would come and be like, neaten yourself up. So always I just kind of roll them, tuck them under, and they'll sit in front of you. When you approach the altar, you will walk up as close as you can to the altar and take a step back. And this is going to be something each person will have to figure out what that space is, because from that step back, you will be, like lighting a candle or an incense at the altar, and you don't want to be having to bend or reach over. So that step back needs to be not too much, so that then you're reaching, but enough that you're not hunched over the altar. And then once you make your step back, is it before or after? Okay, yeah. So you approach you go all the way up to the altar, you do your bow, then you take your step back before you do any lighting or incense or any even picking up a chukpi or anything like that. When you're done working at the altar, you'll take 3 steps back and then do a bow. And if you get really nitpicky, it's stepping back, right foot first, left foot, then right foot, right foot, left foot, right foot together. So the third step is now your feet are together. We tried that for a while, and that was like doing the hokey pokey. So may not be as important for your group. We kind of gave up on that because it was like every week people are like, what's my right? What's my left? Because if you walk backwards, suddenly right and left don't make sense. Go figure. So another common practice form is you never face your back to the altar. Or at least you try as much as you can to avoid putting your back to the altar. And you would see a lot of times in the temple, people walking sideways or at kind of odd angles so that they could maneuver around without turning their back all the way to the altar. And those particular forms are primarily about just respect, treating the altar as a sacred thing, treating everybody else as part of that. Then we look at the altar itself. A traditional altar is 3 levels. In Korea, usually it's set up where the first level is where the incense goes. Sometimes candles, but usually candles go on the second level. The first level will also have where you put fruit offerings. And second level, if you have a lot of fruit offerings, those go on the second level. With the incense, either on the first level or the second level, you put the food offering and the water offering. Food offering goes on the right. If you're facing the altar, it goes on the right, and the water goes on the left. And you try to keep them as balanced, so space them out so that they're not one's too much over on one side than the other. Second level, then usually you have candles. And oftentimes that's where you might have a picture of the teacher, usually in the center. Although in most Korean temples, there's a whole wall and a side altar that is dedicated to the teachers. And then you would have some side altars that would be dedicated to different bodhisattvas. There's usually one for Kishtagarbha, which would go on the right, and then one for Avalokiteshvara, which would go on the left. Again, if you're facing the altar. And those usually were dedicated for people offering memorials, or a memorial usually with the Kishtagarbha side altar. And then requests for prayers or blessings on the Avalokiteshvara altar. Another common bodhisattva that you might see would be Manjushri, which was really common in Korea, or Medicine Buddha. And those usually are on the third level with the main Buddha And something that was interesting that I discovered was that the usual main Buddha on the altar is Amitabha, not Siddhartha. Siddhartha usually had his own little separate statue that was on the left side of the big gold Buddha in the middle, which was usually Amitabha or occasionally Vairocana. Vairocana was the cosmic Buddha who represents Shunyata. And so, because I always wondered why the Buddha in Korea would often have a mustache. And I'd never heard about, the Buddha we know walking around with a mustache. And then I discovered that for some reason the Koreans like to see Amitabha with a mustache, little pencil mustache. And that's when I discovered that almost all of the big Buddhas on the altar on the third level is Amitabha. The third level, like if you were to see our altar setup, it would look like we only had 2 levels. We have our first level with our candles and our incense, and the second level we have the Buddhas. But the third, what makes the third level for our setup are the cushions that are underneath the Buddha statue. So if you can't actually construct a third level, putting a cushion underneath counts. I didn't know that, but apparently it counts as adding a second level or another level. So you'll oftentimes notice that a lot of the setups come in number patterns, like 3s or 4s or 7s. 3s being the most common because of the triple treasure symbology of the Buddhist practice. So if you have a Zen stick or a chukpi, those will usually go on the first level. Sometimes if you have the option, it can go along the side. We have our chukpi right in the very front, and then we have our Zen stick that is behind the candles. Mostly because that's really the only space we have to put that. We would have and I could never remember the name of it, but there's a type of stick that is used during meditation where they would hit you on the back, which sounds terrible, but is actually wonderful because when you're sitting for a long time, your back muscles get tight and knotted. And it's really kind of like an acupressure where they hit this very long, flexible stick and they'll hit you just right in the right spot in your upper back. And it's amazing. It's not only does it feel great, it gets the circulation going and it makes this snap sound, which kind of wakes you up. So if you were to have that and you were doing a meditation retreat, the person would walk behind each person, and as they would approach, if you wanted them to hit you with it, you would bow when they would come, and then they would go, tap, 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 and then to the next person. If you didn't want that, you just stayed sitting. A couple of important things when you're standing at the altar. Some of you now are priests. You most likely have the butterfly sleeve robes, or you may just have regular sleeve robes, but they're loose. Always, always, always approach the altar with your hand holding back the fabric. Even if you think you can slide it up and do it, there is always the chance that it will slip down. And if you're reaching over the altar and there happens to be a candle, the last thing we want to see is you become the incense. And, you know, some of these robes now are, you know, synthetic materials. They will not only go up like a flame, but if you've ever had any of that stuff burn and drip into your skin, it doesn't stop burning. It just cooks right into your skin, and it's awful. So we always want to make sure that when we're reaching, whether it's to grab fruit off the altar, lighting incense, or a candle, doesn't matter what it is, just get into the habit of always holding that sleeve back. Even if you don't have long sleeves, just do it. It's proper form, and it's also good because then you get so used to doing it that it doesn't matter whether you've long sleeves or not, you're just going to always do that.
A quick
The
question.
other, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
A quick question. If you don't have a lighter and you're using matches where you need both hands, you know, holding the box in the left and striking the match by the right, how do you handle it then?
Then that would be, I would push the sleeve up and then turn to the side of the altar and light, and then when you go to then light it, hold the sleeve and then light the candle or the incense. And typically, if you're going to use a flame from the candle to light the incense, which is typically what you're supposed to do, you light it from the right candle. And also, never blow out a candle or incense. Now, people will tell you that that's because it's respectful of the flame or something like that. But I discovered that it's a practical form, because if you blow out a candle, you risk splattering wax or even jumping a flame, blowing out incense, which usually isn't possible, but if you try, you can send sparks out. And so you could, anybody who has had to get wax out of temple cloth knows that they never want to have to get wax out of temple cloth again. So we want to avoid those kind of spills, and scattering even dry ash, because then it just looks terrible on the altar. So we never blow out candles. You have a snuffer, or you suffocate the candle. My teacher always pinched them with her finger, but those were shorter candles. Our candles are tall. We wouldn't be able to pinch them out with our fingers, so we have a snuffer. And
for incense, you can, you know, when you've got it lit, you can just shake it up and down quickly, and the flame will go out usually. And
that's actually the best way, because it also prevents any ash that's accumulated from scattering all over. It will just drop down. Again, make sure your sleeve is away, because if you don't, you could drop the little tip of that incense onto your clothes. So you want to be careful about that. Do it over the altar with your sleeve held back. Another important form that I think you should just get used to doing is everything you do on the altar should be done with two hands. If you're holding a candle, hold it with two hands. If you're taking the lid off of one of the offerings, do it with two hands. If you're passing something to somebody, pass it with two hands. Again, there's a practical in Korea. I don't know if it's all over in the East, but in Korea, I know that that's considered polite etiquette to always pass things with two hands. But the practical part of it is that you're less likely to drop and break a one of a kind or an antique tool if you are holding it with two hands. And I learned the bad way, because I got lax. I didn't follow the form, and I was taking the lid off of one of our offering bowls with one hand, and it slipped out, and then the cover broke. And fortunately I could glue it together, but that right in that moment was like, I remembered I didn't follow form, and I got the results. So I really recommend getting used to that, so that, you know, part of our practice, we do a memorial service at the end of the month, and we have tea. And so we always make sure that we're passing tea with two hands and the person is taking with two hands. Again, no one wants to drop a hot cup of tea in somebody. So, you know, it's just extra insurance that we're you know, taking care of everything and each other.
I'm sorry, just to, it sounds a little contradictory to me. I'm sure it's not, but if you use one hand to hold the sleeve, because, for example, something that you're reaching out is over the candle, then
That counts as two hands, because you've got the other hand holding the sleeve. So I asked the same thing of my teacher, because, you know, she was always saying, you know, two hands. And I said, well, how can you do two hands if you're holding the sleeve back? And she said that counts. And if you are passing something where you don't really need two hands, like you're pouring a pitcher and it has a handle, you put the other hand with that hand. So you're still using two hands, even though you don't really need that one. And that becomes the form. Can you see that? Am I in the camera?
yes, thank you.
So like that. So it counts as two hands, even though you're not really using two. I think that covers the setup. Oh, I remember Douglas asked this about cloth. We have cloths covering the altar because if you lifted it up, it would be plywood hammered together on top of some like old beat up buffet table. So it requires covering up. Traditionally, at least in Korea, most temples are not, or most altars are not covered with a cloth. And that's because the altars are beautiful, oftentimes carved and really, you know, pretty expensive wood. So it would be kind of a shame to cover all that up. But if there is a cloth, it might come in the front. And oftentimes it might have a depiction of some meaningful thing in Buddhist canon, or it could even just have text that says Buddha. Our temple cloth, our altar cloth, has two dragons holding pearls, which is part of an old East Chinese Buddhist story about like a father dragon and a son dragon, and the pearl is some kind of, you know, spiritual attainment. I don't remember the whole story, but you often will see that. And I think, if I remember correctly, we have altar fabric that goes down the back, and I believe there's dragons on that as well. And then sometimes you may have what's called a tanghwa, which is a painting that goes behind the Buddhas, and it usually depicts the Buddha and all of the bodhisattvas and the disciples. And it's usually very stylized, and that will often go behind the altar, so that in many ways the Buddhas are covering up a lot of it. You rarely ever see a tanghwa just bare on a wall by itself. It's almost always with the altar. And not everyone has them. They're usually painted on silk, and they're really expensive. I think, you know, these days you can get probably a poster printout or something, but
Super cheap one here.
the one behind you, yeah. That's the Tibetan wheel, though, isn't it?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
it is.
That would be considered more like a tanka than a tangwa, because the tanka in the Tibetan practice has a spirit, and so it's a sacred thing in and of itself. And if you ever see like a tanka, a traditional tanka, they always have fabric that covers it, because when you're not engaging with it, you're supposed to cover it, because leaving it open could allow the spirit that lives there to escape and get lost. So when you're not using it, you cover it so that it will go to sleep and it won't wander away, and get lost and go, where am I? I never saw that happen, but a couple other little details that are more just decorative. A lot of times in Vietnamese and Korean temples, you will see at the entrance, either into the temple or into the practice space, these two figures. In the temple that I trained at, they were paintings of demons. So you might see these demons on either side of the entrance. And that was always a puzzle to me, because I thought, why are you having two demons right before you enter into your practice space? And I learned that I can't remember, each one had a different name, but they were meant to scare away anybody who had intent to do evil in the practice space. So kind of like gargoyles were meant to scare away evil. They weren't like monsters themselves. These two demonic figures serve the same kind of function. So you might sometimes see that and kind of, wonder, like, I think in more traditional Chinese temples, they're replaced by these stylized lions, sometimes called fu dogs, that are kind of serve the same purpose, but those look cuter, and a little bit more welcoming. You'd see these demons and they've got like tusks coming out and their eyes are like, glaring, and they look really menacing. So I think that covers the primary setup. From that, it's up to you as a Sangha to kind of determine what of that sort of foundational setup you want to keep and what needs to be modified. So some of those things, like I said, we don't worry so much about our feet facing the altar. We don't do, I'm trying to remember, there's a couple things that we stopped. Oh, like, paying attention to which foot we're stepping back with first and stuff like that. It's important to, I think, keep those things fresh in your mind if you ever are planning to visit another temple. And that's why I put it in our liturgy book, because just to have it available, if you're going to go somewhere, review it, refresh your memory, and then remember to always just pay close attention to what everybody's doing and try to follow as closely as you can what they're doing, just to be respectful and to in a sense fit into the Sangha there, because again, the whole idea of this is to melt away our individuality and become one with the community. And so even as a stranger, we can embody that if we, are careful. Of course, you will make mistakes. And most places, I think, here won't hit you. Probably there's some, liability that is, kind of worked into any public space. They don't seem to care too much about that in Korea. And I think it's even worse in Japan. So we're safe in that front. I think if there's any other major form. Any questions? Ansak, yeah.
I just wanted to bring up the eating with your yongasa on.
Oh, yes. Great. Thank you. Yes. If any of you wear your yungasa or your bangasa or your kesa in your practice space, you always remove them when you eat or if you go to the bathroom. And again, I love looking at all of these forms and then asking myself, what's the practical thing for this? Because they really are mostly practical. And of course, if any of you have ever tried to go to the bathroom wearing your robes and your kesa, or if you got married and you're trying to go to the bathroom in your wedding dress, same kind of problem. It's a pain because the last thing you want is that to fall into the toilet. And, obviously you don't want your liturgical wear to get food on it because a lot of them, they're not easy to clean. They either have to be dry cleaned and, the yungasas are, really kind of can't throw those in a washing machine. So you just avoid that mistake. And even if it seems like a pain, it's well worth the time to just remove that stuff, even if you have to go to the bathroom, because in Korea, a lot of the bathrooms are holes in the floor, and the last thing you want is anything to fall down in there. I don't think I need to explain anymore. So yeah, that's a good one. Thank you. Also, we try to only wear the liturgical wear during and for service. So usually we put it on either right before we go into the Dharma room or in the Dharma room before we sit. And then when we're done, we remove them. And again, it, just practical, these, we don't want to have to spend time to have to wash. And some of you know, if you have any of them are linen, you do not want to wash them because then the ironing is a nightmare. And we would spend hours ironing robes for the temple because they were all linen and they, wrinkled if you looked at them. And so, and there was always this particular way. There is actually a particular form for folding those things, which I can't really demonstrate in this format. Again, they're folding them in a certain way. I think Myohye, you found this out, right? That it helps prevent it creating a lot of wrinkles. The way you fold it up really helps. You fold it in with the pleats and everything, and then you fold it in a certain way, and then it doesn't have a whole lot of wrinkles, which was always the pain at the temple because there was always these certain people who just never folded them right. And then we always had to, right before any big event, we'd have to go and iron all of these robes. Yeah.
The only other one I can think of is that we've run into, and I know it drives you crazy, is when people put their dirty dishes on the altar.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So yeah, nothing goes on the altar but altar belongings like food offerings, candles, incense, coffee cups, plastic cups, pencils, anything do not belong on the altar. And another thing I forgot to mention, do you all do any chanting? Some. Do you have a moktak or a bell or anything like that? Yeah, okay. So those never go on the floor. If you sit on the floor, then they need to be on a cushion or a mat. again, it's another thing. It's you know, a way to protect those objects. You don't want to like have someone walk along and kick one. If you have a little table, that's even better. You can put those on. There's I discovered by accident, I live in my great grandparents' house, and my grandmother had this plant stand, and I was so confused by it because I had this hole. It was a wooden plant stand, and it had this hole in the middle. And then one day I was at a temple, and I saw the same exact plant stand, but a bell was sitting on it. And then I realized that it's a stand for a handbell, and the hole is for the ringer part to sit in. And so now we use it for that. But I mean, I don't know where my grandmother got that because she's not a Buddhist. But you know, again, it was a stand just for a bell, so that you wouldn't put the bell just on the floor or bare surface. We always try to have everything elevated. There is a particular form for holding liturgy books. We tried that for a while, but I kind of gave up making everybody try to hold it that way. The thing that I think is more important is you never put a liturgy book on the floor. You know, you never put them where someone sits or a dog jumps on them. We have more dogs in our Sangha than people. So we're always making sure, you know, that you have to look at liturgy books as sacred. They usually have scripture in them. And, you know, we, again, the practical aspect is, you know, temples don't want to have to keep reprinting books all the time because that will get expensive. So we make sure we treat those. A lot of temples will have little stands that the liturgy books go on, so they don't even go on the floor, or you know, you don't have to hold them. Usually you're supposed to hold your books like you're holding in hand prayer position, and then you sit the book in your thumbs, and that is traditionally how you're supposed to hold your liturgy books. We tried that for about a couple of months, and then, you know, one of the things that happened for our Sangha was that right as we kind of got into more traditional practice form, the pandemic came, and then we all practiced at home, and then we came back and realized nobody remembered practice forms. And so I have been a little less stringent on, you know, getting everybody. I tried to get us to do the particular ones like sleeves, two hands, don't put things on the floor, that kind of stuff, because those have a practical function for even our group. So when you're looking at those for your group, I think that's what you want to try to pay attention to is, you know, how do you set up your stuff? What in the traditional sense can you utilize that will benefit that setup? What way can you incorporate some of these forms into how you do your regular practice so that it allows people to begin to come together? And what's really kind of neat about when you see a group that operates under a practice form and you're looking in as a new person, it's almost like watching, I mean, Barbie, you talked about how, you know, you came from Catholic service. It's one of the things I loved when I was a kid about Catholic service was how it looked like this performance. You know, it was like everybody was doing, you know, the things up there, and it just it was so beautiful with all the fabric and the things, and it almost became like a transcendent experience just in that. And I've seen that at temples when you would see all the people up walking through and doing the rituals and holding the forms and all that stuff. there's something really powerful once your group gets that form down and you're no longer really thinking about it and you're just doing it. You'll really feel, I don't know if the people from our Sangha have experienced that, but even for me watching at times, it's really, you feel like you're part of something special. And I hope that you can all kind of find that for your group, and in a way that supports your practice, but also maybe pushes you a little bit to get to that place where you struggle a little against it because either it's too boring or it feels confining. Again, our American culture likes to fight against that all the time. This idea, I'm not going to conform, and so if you have enough practice form where that comes up, then that's good, because there's a function for that. And it can be really powerful when someone practices it long enough to experience what comes on the other side of that. All right. Well, thank you so much. I hope that you find some, maybe even just look at what you're doing already and see if you can identify some of the forms that are already there, and then go from there.